All right, well, thank you so much to the LabX group, to André, Catherine, and Philippe for organising this wonderful event. It's really encouraging to see such an enthusiastic group of graphic design history fans, and I think it bodes well for the future of the discipline. So I'm glad to be a part of this. Okay, so I'm going to plunge right in here. In his inaugural address as the first director of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham in 1963, the sociologist Richard Hoggart outlined an approach to what he called literature and contemporary cultural studies. Hoggart identified four main foci for this nascent discipline: writers and artists. How do they become what they are, and what are their financial rewards? Audiences, what expectations do they have? And what background knowledge do they bring? Opinion formers, guardians, the elite, the clerisy. Where do they come from, and what are their channels of influence? And the organisation for the production and distribution of the written and spoken word. What are their natures, financial and otherwise? Lastly, Hoggart spoke of an urgent need to find out more about what happens when all four of these shaping forces interact, as he describes here, about interrelations between writers and their audiences, and about their shared assumptions, about interrelations between writers and organs of opinion, between writers, politics, power, class, and cash. Hoggart's summary of the concerns of this new centre also aptly describes the project of an historian of design criticism. And that's what I am. Or at least I have been recently, as I've been completing a PhD in the history of design, and where my research focused on design criticism in the US and the UK, with a particular focus on the relationship between critics and their publics. In the course of this research, I actually consider design criticism in many different manifestations, formats such as conferences, to which was alluded earlier, exhibitions, and I quickly pulled this one out for you. This is the gas pump by Elliot Noyes in the Boiler House exhibition, which I was studying in the 1980s. Blogs, and even designed objects themselves. So from my point of view, design criticism exists in all of those different formats and many more. But for this talk, however, I'm going to focus on one of the more conventional of those formats, an article about design, of the type found in a trade magazine, through which I will illuminate some of those shaping forces that we just saw that Hoggart referenced. So the argument that I want to introduce to this conference is that design criticism and commentary, things specifically like articles, should be included in design history's purview, and not just as raw primary source material, but also as the central point of study. Magazines are already embraced, as some excellent studies by speakers at this conference, among others, attest. You can find thoughtful considerations of such design magazines as Typographica, Architectural Review, Emigre, Nibonnet, and many more of the design of other magazines such as Charm, Arc, Spy, Nova, and so on. Building on this momentum, I'd like to suggest that the article itself also be considered as a designed object. After all, it's made of ink and paper, or at least it used to be. Images and words, arranged into a composition by an art director, and is subject to similar economic pressures as other designed products. Magazine articles are most often used by historians as the source of useful quotations, right? Chunks of spicy opinion to be plucked out and incorporated in new texts in support of new arguments. The original articles thus become vestiges of their former selves, languishing in the footnotes, as frequently misreferenced references. If an article gets used in its entirety, it will usually be as a degraded photocopy, or stripped of images and editorial emphasis for conversion to a PDF, or an online version, or edited and even rewritten for inclusion in an anthology. If the argument of an article is strong enough, it should be able to withstand such mutations of format. But I still think there's much to be gained, much historical knowledge to be gained from returning it to its mooring in a magazine. Design criticism is intended for a particular time, place, and audience, and that place and audience and time's conception of their near future. By revisiting an article's original location in a publication, one can revivify the values, politics, and pressures that shaped it, the dialogue that it was a part of, and the community within which it had specific purpose, in which it mattered. In 1984, the design historian Clive Dilnot suggested that a history of the rise of the design journal as the vehicle for projecting the ideology or value of design would be an enormous contribution to understanding the profession's self-promotion of design values. To map the changing values, ideas, and beliefs expressed or communicated in text and graphic layout could, in a sense, map the history of the professions. Is the history literally contained in the glossy pages of domus or industrial design? I agree with Dilnot that there's a lot we can gain and can be contributed to design history by gleaning information from those glossy pages of domus or industrial design. However, his view of the design journal as simply a self-promoting projector of the values of the design profession is limiting. Magazines, encompass the contrary views of and complex relationships between publishers, editors, writers, art directors, photographers, readers, and subjects in ways far more heterodox than Dilnot's assessment suggests. Since the early 1950s, design critics have attempted to balance the perceived needs of their various constituencies, which include designers, manufacturers, policymakers, and consumers, with the aims of the commissioning publication of and their personal literary ambitions. So I think a more nuanced study of design magazines should account for the variety of voices and opinions expressed, the social, economic, and political motivations that fuel their writers, and especially for those moments of resistance to design's prevailing ideologies and values that occur on their pages. This flux of contradictory ideas, imperatives, and interpretations I call the dynamics of criticism. So now I'd like to examine the dynamics of one particular article. And suggest some ways in which this method of historical inquiry might be generally useful to many of us. So this article I'm going to talk about was written by the British artist Richard Hamilton and published in Design magazine in February 1960. So first off, I'm just going to give you a little background to this. Many of you probably know this, but just to recap. The Council of Industrial Design was a government agency established in London in 1944, so just towards the end of the war, in anticipation of the need for a post-war boost to Britain's manufacturing industries. It had a two-pronged mission, which was to raise consumer taste and to encourage manufacturers to produce better designed goods. And it had a whole plethora of tools and methods by which it did this. The council was organised into the Industrial Division and the Information Division, which corresponded to its dual objective of I think we can see it right there, the creation of a supply of good design and then the creation of the demand for good design. So that's what they were about. Design magazine, founded in 1949, was its journal of record. The magazine, which fell under the auspices of the Information Division, which we just mentioned, reported on consumer goods which already had the stamp of approval from the Council of Design. Appropriate materials, good appearance, good workmanship, suitability for purpose, and pleasure in use were some of the recurring criteria by which examples of good design were selected for the Council's Design Index, and by extrapolation for inclusion in the magazine. A 1954 readership survey revealed that its readers were not particularly inspired by the magazine's reliance on the unexplained absolute of good design for its editorial decision-making. The survey makers summarized the readers' responses by saying, quote, "There's a good deal of demand for articles presenting points of view other than an official one," end quote. It is also telling that the survey found that the most popular section in this magazine devoted to the improvement of British product design was in actual fact the Foreign Review. By February 1960, things hadn't actually changed that much with the magazine. The issue in which Hamilton's article was published included a piece on street furniture with an introduction by the Minister of Transport, an article about a stool designed to help factory workers move between workstations, and a report about a new melamine teacup. These kinds of informative but rather dry articles about aspects of design's application to British industry were a mainstay of the magazine at the time. The showcase projects tended to be worthy municipal initiatives evaluated through the good design lens in earnest, sometimes hectoring language, illustrated with black and white photographs. The left-wing poet, essayist, and former editor of Encounter magazine, Stephen Spender, in a 1958 speech to the Society of Industrial Artists, crystallized mounting unease among the design-conscious public about the council's stultifying bias towards functionalism. Spender saw too many designed goods pincered between what he termed the two extremes of utilitarian functionalism, the airplane on one flank and the kitchen utensil on the other. He listed the visual attributes of functionalism as bareness, simplicity, squareness or roundness, solidity, seriousness, and warned that saying the functional is beautiful, a message that was often contained in the pages of Design magazine, is really a sleight of hand. He continued, "I know the objection to my way of thinking. It is that designers are designing today for the socialized welfare state man, leading him down the well-worn garden path, educating him gently with discourse piped from the third program. None must talk too loud, no one must flash a light too brightly in his eyes. There must be no violent splashes of colour. He must be anaesthetized with good taste. And who but the British? With the British Council, the Arts Council, the third program, the Design Centre, Panathol, chlorophyll, Dettol know most about disinfectants and anaesthetics." This is a great quote, right? Only a year later came along a writer more than willing to talk loudly, flashlights and splash colour in the faces of the taste anaesthetists at the Council of Industrial Design. Richard Hamilton upset the delicate balance of good taste, the belief that usefulness and beauty were codependent, and the adherence to design reform social values that the Council had endeavoured to maintain in the post-war years. Hamilton was born in London. He was the son of a car showroom driver, and he sort of schooled himself in art at a variety of adult education evening classes. He went to the Royal Academy schools. He did some engineering draftsmanship at a government training centre during the war, and finally at the Slade. In the final year of his studies at the Slade, he became involved in the independent group meetings at the Institute of Contemporary Art, the ICA. This was a loose-knit salon, included artists, critics, and architects such as Lawrence Alloway, Rainer Banham, Theo Crosby, and Alison and Peter Smithson. This group started meeting in 1952 to plan exhibitions and discuss ideas about the machine aesthetic, science fiction, communication theory, and all other aspects of pop culture, specifically American pop culture. These discussions constituted a rebuttal to prevailing standards of good taste in 1950s Britain, and in particular directed at the founders of the ICA, the critics and collectors of modern art, Herbert Reed and Roland Penrose. In terms of design, Hamilton's drafting apprenticeship put him in contact with the industrial designer Misha Black, with whom he worked on a heated breakfast tray, bizarrely, among other products. Hamilton also worked on models of new towns for the Festival of Britain and consulted as a designer at Granada Television. In addition to writing contextual explanations for his paintings, between 1958 and 1960, Hamilton wrote quite a few articles about design in Architectural Design, The Architect's Journal, Uppercase, and Design, among other publications. So the article that I'm going to eventually get to discuss, I promise, was based on a lecture that he had delivered in 1959 at the ICA to members of the independent group. The lecture was titled The Design Image of the 50s, and it presented a succession of images of appliances such as washing machines, vacuum cleaners, radios, and refrigerators. And it applauded the ways in which the advertising industry had created such compelling images of these consumer goods. Hamilton described his ICA presentation as being rather exotic. He had 3 projectors and 3 screens, one of which took up the whole of the back wall of the ICA room, which was then located on Dover Street in London. This format was his response to the multi-screen film Glimpses of the USA, produced by the American designers Charles and Ray Eames, for which that they'd made for the 1959 American National Exhibition in Moscow. And in that, they'd used 2,200 images projected on 7 20 by 30 foot screens. And this whole spectacle had been published in the April 1959 issue of the American magazine Industrial Design. We see the cover of it here. Now, Hamilton had been tipped off to this magazine, Industrial Design, which would prove very important to him, by his fellow independent group member, Rayner Bannon. And he used to go to consult it in the US Embassy Library on Grosvenor Square. And in its pages, he found the consumer appliances that featured in his lecture and article and would feed many other aspects of his work. So Hamilton's lecture and article celebrated the very qualities that the Council of Industrial Design was pitched against. Qualities such as surface-level styling, glamour, ephemerality, and planned obsolescence, to name a few. He was particularly impressed by the ways in which manufacturers hired image makers to help manipulate consumers to buy the products they had already created. An efficient system, in Hamilton's view, where, and this is the key phrase of the article, the consumer can come from the same drawing board as the product. Hamilton thought that for American designers, the most important aspects of design were not appearance or usefulness, but rather the economic sustainability of the production and consumption cycle. In Hamilton's view, the virtue of American industrial design was that it had come to terms with a mass society in ways that British designers still seemed incapable of. So Hamilton's article was pretty conspicuous in the pages of Design through its role as, like I've said, as a conduit for American economic perspectives, such as the idea that manufacturing efficiency and national prosperity were contingent on accelerated obsolescence, and these ideas had been discussed in the States by economists like Peter Drucker. In his 1956 article on obsolescence, the American industrial designer George Nelson had explained that America's wealth was actually dependent on wastefulness, which enabled mass production at an ever-increasing pace. And in this article, Nelson astutely characterized the European view, or the suspected European view of this situation as, quote, a blend of appalled curiosity, downright disbelief, righteous indignation and envy, end quote. What he didn't foresee, though, was what would happen when a self-proclaimed intellectual artist like Hamilton added his own ambivalent stance to that mix. Hamilton seemed convinced that rapid large-scale consumption improved manufacturing processes and boost industry, and deduced that as a result of that, he said, increased productive capacity is a basic social good. And that's the contents. And in fact, the righteously indignant response came not from Europe, but from an American, the social critic and journalist Vance Packard, whose 1960 book, The Wastemakers, was a hard-hitting social critique of planned obsolescence. Just going to go back there. Hamilton conceived of industrial designers not in terms of their craftsmanship or their public service-driven problem-solving, which was what Design magazine tended to value, but rather as canny commercial operators, describing them variously as marketing aides, men who establish the visual criteria, operators of the machinery of motivation control, and collaborators with ad man, copywriter, and feature editor. Very interesting kind of constructions of the designer from an outsider's viewpoint. Hamilton especially admired the people who knowingly constructed the designed image of our present society in the pages of glossy magazines. These were the very images, after all, that provided Hamilton and other members of the independent group with such a rich source of raw material for their discussions and artworks. So we talked of their creators' skill and imagination and wit and quoted their slogans, things like plush at popular prices, surely aware of the goading effects that such language would have on Design magazine's readership. Even the very use of the word glossy would have triggered complex reactions in post-war Britain. Paper rationing continued in Britain for several years after the end of the war, and even by 1960, British magazines were rarely printed on gloss paper stock. Hamilton was using the word to describe American magazines, such as Life, Look, and Esquire, but he was also aware of the pejorative nature of the term's metaphoric connotations in a post-war Britain fearful of Americanizing influences, of ersatz and candy floss mass arts on the previously organic expressions and oral traditions of working class culture. This was how left-wing sociologist Richard Hoggart, who we met at the beginning, framed it. In the 1957 book, The Uses of Literacy, Hoggart used the term glossy as a negative label for the kinds of furniture, shops, novelettes, and magazines he believed were exerting such a worrying influence on British society. But Hamilton was really keen to draw a distinction between the popular arts, in that old sense as something arising organically from the masses that Hoggart had championed, and his own conception of a more industrialized and calculated pop art, which he saw as stemming, quote, from a professional group with a highly developed cultural sensibility. In a 1960 lecture at the National Union of Teachers Conference, Hamilton re-emphasized the difference between unsophisticated working-class popular arts such as club singing on the one hand and the current manifestations of the commercially driven urbane pop culture he was so fascinated by on the other. He said, "The analysts of popular culture in recent years have been negative in their approach. White, Packard, Hoggart, whose ideas, as we know, have been given full rein in the mass media, are unanimous in their condemnation of gloss, glamour, and professionalism. The story is the same. The end of the world is upon us unless we purge ourselves of the evils of soft living and reject the drive for social and economic advantages." End quote. So the title of Hamilton's design article, Persuading Image, also evokes another of Vance Packard's books, his 1997 book, Hidden Persuaders, a best-selling critique of motivation research, which was referred to as MR, a practice being used by the American advertising and marketing industries to depth probe the consumer psyche. Equally provocative to design's readership, perhaps, was Hamilton's use of the word image. In the title, at Design there was a real suspicion of the visual image. The technical and functional attributes of products were always stressed as if in compensation for the superficial allure of their visual appearance. And this suspicion of the image went hand in hand with suspicion of American culture and design. A review of an exhibition of American design held at the US Trade Center in London reveals the editor's disdain for the commercial nature of American packaging design, concluding that there was little on display, quote, that would have been acceptable to even the most Catholic of British selection panels. this anti-American sentiment was widespread in British commentary of the period. Cultural critic Raymond Williams wrote in 1962 that the very worst of mass media, quote, is American in origin. At certain levels, we are culturally an American colony, end quote. For Hamilton, though, the constructed image was far from sinister. The exchange of art-directed images was a shared connection among his peers who were obsessed by what he called pinboard culture. He said, quote, we would walk into the houses of friends and find we all had exactly the same picture. There was a picture of an American model wearing a backless dress showing her backside cleavage, which was very venturesome. That was on everyone's pinboards, end quote. The image of Vicky Dugan, that's the name of the model, she was a swimwear model at the time, framed by a low-cut white dress used to illustrate, and it was used in the Persuading Image article, was clipped from the magazine Esquire and reworked for the artwork Hamilton created between 58 and 61, titled She. You can see the development there. I have a few other examples of the way in which he lent on the imagery and actually the text of magazines. This is from Industrial Design magazine on the left, and it's written by an amazing car critic from the 1950s called Deborah Allen. And she concludes this amazing review of a 1955 Buick with the line, hers is a lush situation, which you might recognize as being developed into the title of a whole series of paintings by Hamilton, one of which you can see here. And just one more. This is an image from, I found it in Industrial Design magazine, and this is Hamilton's kind of working with it. Richard Hamilton's self-portrait, created for the cover of a 1963 ICA publication titled Living Arts, also demonstrates his relish for the construction of the image, right? So the image was photographed from above by photojournalist Robert Freeman, and it features a 1963 Ford Thunderbird with a lingerie model sprawled on the back, and a male model wearing an American football uniform leaning on the hood, a Mercury spacecraft capsule on loan from Shepperton Film Studios, a refrigerator stuffed with American food, a wondergram, a vacuum cleaner, telephone, typewriter, and toaster, all arranged on a background of high-gloss pink paper. In a 14-item list of the crew and props it took to produce this image, printed on the magazine's title page, Hamilton credits the photographer and the stylist, and lists himself as the producer of the image, a label notably different from those used by British designers and commenters of the period. He's really trying to professionalize this activity. Okay, so considering how divergent Hamilton's article was from the Council of Industrial Design's values and design's typical content, why did the magazine's editor commission this piece? Most historical accounts portray Design magazine as merely a propagandist mouthpiece of the Council of Industrial Design. And there are certainly grounds for this view, but there was also a tension at play in the pages of Design between the principles of council-endorsed good design on the one hand and the imperatives of critical journalism on the other. Judging from the memos and minutes of Design magazine meetings between 1954 and 1978, which are held in the archive at the University of Brighton, the editors were often under pressure from the Council's Information Division to include in the magazine council-approved consumer goods, and especially those manufactured by its trustees, who were also advertisers in the magazine and thus among its main sources of income. By the early 1960s, even though the Council of Industrial Design had started off as a government-funded initiative, by the 1960s, advertising had actually assumed an increased influence in the magazine's editorial content. Particularly objectionable to the management were articles that seemed in any way, quote, anti-British industry, unquote, and the fact that Design's editorial was increasingly devoted to overseas material, which presented them with what they termed an almost hopeless task for gaining advertisements. But editors like Michael Farr and his mentee, John Blake, who had a journalistic appreciation for controversy and saw their role as injecting lively debate into the journal's pages. Farr edited the magazine from 1952 until 1960, when Blake took over. But Farr was still working at the council as the head of the information division, so he was still working in the background. According to Design's art director from this period, the graphic designer Ken Garland, Michael Farr relished stirring the pot of controversy. Farr was interested enough in other design and consumer magazines to instruct Garland to prepare for him a monthly report on them. Prior to joining Design, Farr had also worked as news editor for the Architect's Journal and the Architectural Review. And in Architectural Review during 1959 and 1960, and I'm really sorry I don't have the images of them with me here, but the critical debates contained in the magazine were signalled with the use of yellow paper stock, red type, and attention-grabbing typographic devices such as starbursts, enlarged quote marks, and arrows, really kind of signalling, okay, this is criticism you're about to read. And this was all meant to lead to as many letters to the editor as possible so you could really kind of sustain the debate across issues. It's probable, therefore, that in asking writers like Hamilton and at other times Rayner Banham and Lawrence Alloway to contribute to Design, articles that really kind of challenged its worldview, Farr and Blake were seeking to emulate Architectural Review's debate-generating strategy in the hope of gaining more readers. So within the pages of this issue, Hamilton's article was the lead piece. Some of its pages were printed on bright yellow paper and colour tints were used at a time when colour only tended to appear in the magazine when manufacturers paid for it to better show off their products. Ken Garland, the art director, recalls that the bolding of key phrases, which you can see here, such as control of the consumer, was to enliven and emphasize the text and was done in consultation with Hamilton, which again I think is probably an unusual situation for author and art director to be kind of composing the page together like that. Hamilton's use of imagery was also unique in the pages of Design. The images he and Garland selected floated elusively alongside the text. They were kind of suggestive rather than directly referenced examples. Also floating were Hamilton's enigmatic captions, which quoted advertising slogans and editorial hyperbole as a form of poetry. Beneath a selection of images of car detailing and a page excerpted from Look magazine, for example, is the text, "Functionalism is not enough for Americans," says the page from Look, and the automobile body designer knows it. Although this kind of unfiltered sampling of American advertising and editorial language helped distinguish Hamilton's artworks, where the ambiguity lends the works their interesting tension, I think it sits pretty uneasily on the pages of Design. Blake titled his editorial for this issue, Consumers in Danger, and under the guidance of Farr, he primed his readers by promising them a controversial article with a conclusion of a form of economic totalitarianism not greatly dissimilar from Orwell's terrifying prophecy, end quote. He concluded his introduction with the rhetorically loaded question, do we believe it is more important for industry and the designer to serve the real needs of the consumer? Or are we content with the prospect of the consumer becoming a pawn in the grip of an economic master who rules exclusively to serve his own ends? End quote. So Blake promised a continuation of the debate in future issues, just the same as the way that Architectural Review had been doing it. And so he asked a selection of designers and design critics from Europe and America to respond to the piece. Among those invited to respond were the critic Rayner Banham, who was then executive editor at Architectural Review, Misha Black, the industrial designer and professor of industrial design at the RCA, and D.W. Morphy of Morphy Richards. Most objected to what they perceived to be Hamilton's lack of social responsibility, his immorality even, and his complicity with reviled American values. The discussion continued in the form of readers' letters in subsequent issues, but Hamilton was given the last word. He wrote, The phrase that caused the alarm, designing the consumer to the product, is a redefinition of a well-known process. For the ultimate political evil, it was called fascism. When directed at purely commercial objectives, it is called salesmanship. Without the moral overtones, it is known as education. We are all concerned in one way or another with the conversion of others to a point of view, end quote. Writing of the effects of Hamilton's persuading image article, design historian John Hewitt has concluded that, for the Design Council, the very idea of controlling the consumer and of integrating him into the market process in order to meet purely commercial objectives was total anathema. And yet, ironically, it had also been the Council's long-standing mission to mould British consumers by seeking to educate them in the principles of good design. Design magazine specifically, as it came under more pressure to sell more issues, was beginning, if not exactly to depth probe its consumers, certainly to show curiosity about them. While Hamilton's article was being published, Design's managers were in the process of employing a market research firm to conduct surveys with their readers. Mass Observation's 1961 report on Design magazine's readership unearthed a litany of grumbles about the magazine's form and content. It turned out that the consumer of design was harder to shape than its managers thought. Readers had specific views about design and how it could be improved. It was deemed by some as too arty and academic, or not sufficiently up-to-date, while others objected to the criteria it used to judge good design. Others thought it needs more outside writers and should be aimed more at the man in the street. One of the subscribers interviewed, a production planning manager in an engineering firm, objected to the parochial tendencies of the magazine and said he wanted more variety among the contributors. In explaining his request, he unconsciously, or maybe consciously, quoted Hamilton's persuading image article, saying, "Design should deal with the social side of design. You can now design the customer to the product, as well as the product to the customer." So it appeared that however heterodoxical Hamilton's argument might have been in the context of the Council of Industrial Design's anti-commercial, socially and morally driven view of design, amongst design's actual readership, its message hit home. I'm just going to skip this bit. Okay. Hamilton did not consider himself a design critic. "I've always thought of myself as a design hobbyist," he later told me. And yet he had clear views about his role as an educator, which do seem to have translated into his critical writing. He said, "It is for us as teachers to promote in the youth we teach a healthy suspicion of all dogma, whether it is politically oriented or aimed at fixing the pattern of our culture," end quote. He said in the 1960 lecture to the National Union of Teachers, that's what he said, he believed that in order to achieve what he called freedom of choice, the youth of today should, I'll get there in a minute, should be made fully aware of the techniques of mass media, whose products they already know and appreciate, end quote. So Hamilton's perceptive analysis of the techniques of image making, the social and economic implications of mass-produced goods, and the inevitability of expendability helped to challenge the main current of design discourse in post-war Britain, with a level of authority seldom found among the writings of establishment-sanctioned design commentators of the period. So hopefully it's clear how this kind of granular reading of a text might enrich our understanding of a historical period and throw new light on the relationship between design, production, consumption, and mediation. I'm also interested in how it might enrich or at least complicate an understanding of criticism. Where in the design criticism, in that configuration I've just outlined, does the criticism reside? Is it what is spoken or written? Or is it what is received and the responses it stimulated? Is it a cumulative concentrate produced by these elements? Something in the air that is debated and challenged? What survives and enters the discourse? Or what even causes change? Does criticism stop being criticism and become something else when it's removed from its market and anthologized? Does it achieve its liveness and energy only through its context, where it is eternally poised with a potential to affect change? These kinds of questions also feed my current practice as an educator of design writers and critics. And, we've talked a bit in this conference so far about trying to forge these links between history and the present, and I'm always trying to do that. And these students are engaging with multiple and often social formats to broadcast their criticism and gather their feedback. The article, as it existed in 1960, a kind of cohesive narrative developed verbally and visually over a sequence of pages in a printed magazine, is a rare breed today, as we know. Today's contingent reading experience is very different, as we enter online articles or posts, not through the framing device of a magazine or even a shaped article, but via a link, which takes us directly to the text, which then reassembles responsively to whatever reading device we're accessing it through. So clearly, design publishing is in a moment of anxious flux, and I think it's extra important for emerging critics as well as historians to understand how their work will be encountered and to think imaginatively about the range of channels of communication available to them. I'm just going to very quickly show you a few examples of kind of the stuff we've been playing around with and then conclude with that. So yeah, it's just always about trying to, in the way that Rick was talking about yesterday, to really consider, not just burying ourselves in the archives, but also thinking how we will communicate what we find when we get there. So we teach radio podcasting, so that seems to be a really vibrant format at the moment, and one in which many journalists are using, and I think historians can make ample use of. We make video essays with an iPhone. As you can see, there are many kind of add-ons that you can use to really get the most out of this, and we have a lot of fun working with video essays. We make chapbooks, and we hold readings. I make the poor students present in front of 700 people at a conference. We have book clubs with members of the public. We work a lot with tweeting. Using it as in many different styles: reportage, narrative, interpretation, and critique. And then we figure out how to get it back out onto the street through projections, through pasting them back out into the street. And this was the one we did this year, which was in the form of a newspaper, which you can see some panels from. Also, the students have taken their thesis research and turned it into the vehicles that they think will communicate best with their audiences. So just a couple of examples of those. This student was exploring the graphic designer's complicity in misleading packaging, right, for organic foods, which is often not organic at all. So she created this fun little bingo card you could take around the supermarket with you to spot these overused visual tropes. And she went further and actually developed a pop-up exhibition in a bodega, which drew attention to the issue. Another student had been wondering why guns weren't included in design museums, because they weren't at the time. The Design Museum in London now has one. Created a sort of augmented reality app that you could take into the MoMA to insert your own narrative where it should be relevant to the actual collection, which was kind of fun. And this was a good one. This student was studying the kind of looking at the role of policy making in social housing in New York, and so to communicate that, she made an audio guided tour and a Spotify list of all the hip hop songs that reference the specific issues in social housing, which were good. And then just lastly, this is a fun one, a student who was exploring the problematics of exhibiting graphic design in the museum or the gallery and what happens when it's decontextualized, decided to take the museum out onto the street and produce regular exhibitions, which you would be guided around using a map and an app to look at various exhibits in the city. So, I hope that future design historians have as much fun recontextualizing these projects as I did with the historical instances of design criticism. And it gives you a little glimpse of, hopefully, some things going forward. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and let's take some questions.